Welcome back, everyone. We're going to move into our final panel of the day, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce the organizer and moderator for this panel, my friend and colleague, Kathleen Schuler, who serves as the Policy Director for Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate. If you know any of the great policy work that we've been doing over the past few years, then you've seen Kathleen's handiwork. She's written policy briefs, testified in front of the legislature, and organized so many of our actions and activities. And we're so grateful for her passion and commitment to this really important work. So I will hand things over to Kathleen to move us forward with this panel.
Thanks so much, Brenna, for your kind words. I'd like to welcome everyone to Climate Justice, Addressing Climate and Health Through an Equity Lens. We have a fantastic panel today. I'm Kathleen Schuler, as Brenna said, Policy Director with HPHC. We're here to talk about climate justice, and it's really great that climate justice has been a thread through the previous presentations. We are seeing the effects of our changing climate, wildfires, floods, extreme storms, extreme heat, air pollution, and infectious diseases that disrupt lives and communities across the globe. No group is feeling these effects more acutely than Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Systemic racism has created greater underlying social vulnerability, placing the health and lives of BIPOC communities at greater risk. We can only solve the climate crisis by dismantling the racism and exploitation that created the current economic power system. We have an amazing panel today to talk about these impacts and how we can address them. I'm going to introduce each of our panel members, just a brief introduction, and then you can look at their bios for their complete bios. So Dr. Sam Grant is Executive Director of Rainbow Research. And for 30 years, he has been researching and organizing at the intersection of racial, gender, economic, and environmental justice. Dr. Brook Cunningham is the general internist, and she is Assistant Commissioner for the Health Equity Bureau at the Minnesota Department of Health. Reverend Dr. Elika Galloway is co-pastor of Liberty Community Church in Minneapolis and CEO of the Northside Healing Space. Leah Prussia is a clinical social worker and associate professor in the MSW program at the College of St. Scholastica. Now I will turn it over to Sam Grant, who will moderate our session. So Sam. Oh, do we have Sam joining us yet?
He's not on yet, so perhaps we can go to our speakers.
Yes, so first up is Dr. Brook Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. So I've been sort of tasked with putting climate change and environmental justice in a social context. And when we think about equity, we have to think about race and racism. And so I'm going to start with a brief, quick hit and overview of that, and then highlight some things specifically around the Life and Breath report that the Minnesota Department of Health has updated for 2022. So let me share my screen with you all. So can I get a thumbs up that you all can see my screen?
Thumbs up.
Wonderful. So as we talk about equity, and particularly, we know the important role in how race as a system has shaped inequality and inequity in the United States. So I'd like to touch on what race actually is for this audience, just so that we're all on the same page. So race at its basic is about hierarchy. It's a hierarchical social classification system. It's grounded in the now deep-seated belief that there are innate essential differences between groups. Now, historically, sort of back in the 17th century, et cetera, those beliefs, and I mean, even till today, to be quite honest, in biomedicine and some associated spaces, right? The focus has been about biological differences as people sort of unseated the relationship between biology and race and started to, right, say the refrain, we're all human, and know that there's more variation actually between races, I mean, within races than between races. There persists a belief in the cultural differences between groups. But race, again, fundamentally is designed to restrict the rights, opportunities, and access to resources of some. In the United States and actually globally, it's often those characterized as not white, thereby creating privileged access to others. And again, those characterized as white. And what you will hear when people say race is they often say it's a social construct, meaning that it's an idea that we came up with as human beings. But what I like to lift up is that it's a socio-political phenomenon, right? And so yes, it's a social fact. It shapes interactions, but it's a political tool that shapes access to power and resources. And when we talk about structural racism, you know, that for many people is a black box. It's not clear exactly what we're talking about. But when people start talking about systemic racism or structural racism, they're highlighting a few things, right? They're highlighting systems and the expansiveness of systems. They're highlighting policies, practices, and even again, going back to the idea of race as a structure that kind of constrains our thinking. I really like people to, like, if they can wrap their mind around structures, to actually think about the power of a structure, the stability of a structure, right? If you think about the building that you're sitting in now, its foundation, its walls, it's meant to endure some of the changes, but this might come up, right, that we see with climate change, right, with extreme weather patterns, right? It's this stability also that comes up with structures. And most commonly in public health and biomedicine, we've talked about structures, thinking about upstream determinants of health. So the social determinants of health that are upstream, like education, employment, transportation. The other thing that we have to highlight when we start trying to understand equity and climate impact is that racism is really about disproportionate impact across groups. And so it's about both disproportionate, as I said on the other side, disproportionate access to resources, which is in that middle bullet, but it's also about disproportionate exposure to risk. And that's what probably many of our speakers today will talk about. And I'm going to talk about air pollution in a second, but disproportionate exposure to risk, disproportionate access to resources once you encounter risk or adverse health outcome, and disproportionate incidence or prevalence of adverse outcomes. And the thing about structural racism is it often occurs without intent, right? And the shift in the discourse that many people are trying to get us to is to recognize that you can have disproportionate impact across racial groups without intent, without a boogeyman like behind the curtain. Although there are certain structural factors in our country at play right now that are surely with intent as people think about voting and as they think about redistricting, even in race neutral, but on paper it looks race neutral. So, but it is often without intent. And so what I just wanted to highlight, and this is a picture of Minneapolis, and redlining may have already come up today. I'm sure will come up in our panel, but this is a picture of Minneapolis's redlining map in the 1930s. And if it hasn't already been mentioned today, you know, redlining is a government-sponsored practice of racially discriminatory mortgage appraisal and lending strategies. So, you know, people talk about redlining, they don't often talk about its history. Like we have a sense that redlining contributed to social segregation and neighborhood risk, but it came out of a program in the New Deal era that was really a Depression era measure, the Home Owners Loan Corporation, to really stabilize the mortgage and the housing markets back in the Depression era. And what folks did, this Home Owners Loan Corporation, which was a federal agency, drew these maps and colored neighborhoods. And so you see the red neighborhoods in the map of Minneapolis on that map. And of course, those red neighborhoods were neighborhoods with higher concentrations of Black folk, immigrant populations, and were deemed higher risk for loans. And so what happens when you deem a neighborhood higher risk? Well, there's systematic disinvestment in that neighborhood that affects, you can have, the same house, but when you characterize it in a higher risk, lower quality, if you label a neighborhood as that, because it's really a process, redlining is a process of labeling associated with who lived in the neighborhoods, and those folk have difficulty gaining home equity, wealth accumulation. So going back to our resources when disease occurs, communities suffer from disinvestment. And this is often what we see when we talk about investment, particularly of both the private sector into communities, so food insecurity. But we also talk about the placement of toxic hazards and polluting industries in those neighborhoods, because with wealth comes power and influence and voice. And often within those neighborhoods, what they were systematically of lower power, lower financial influence, and thereby lower voice. So when we think about our interstate highway system, when we think about I-94 and the metro area, when we think about air pollution and climate change that comes from car emissions, when we think about eminent domain to take housing and put in those highways and create that additional risk from the car emissions, these are the historical factors that lead to differential outcomes from communities of color, both differential exposure to air pollution, as well as differential disease incidence and prevalence. And so if you all ever have a moment, I would encourage you to go look at the Life and Breath report. This is the website, but you could just Google it by putting Life and Breath Report Minnesota into your browser. And what the very smart epidemiologists at MDH did was they sort of looked at the contribution of air pollution and ozone. We think about ozone really like out in the atmosphere ozone, but there's ground level ozone that also impacts health. And they really looked at that both in terms of excess death as well as these non-fatal impacts that I'll show very quickly on these next slides. And so the really point of these two slides quickly is to just look at these trends. Look at how high those bars go. So the bars get higher as poverty, from left to right. As poverty increases, those bars go up. They're divided between asthma hospitalizations, cardiovascular hospitalizations, respiratory hospitalizations, and ED visits. It's a combo metric, but basically all of those health risks from particulate matter, which is PM, which is often from cars, et cetera, increase with poverty, increase with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, concentration in neighborhoods, increase with the number of people who are uninsured, these hospitalizations and ED presentations, and increase with the number of people who are living with disabilities. And we see the very same pattern, higher for particulate matter. If you peeped the sort of y-axis, but still here for ozone, the same pattern as poverty increases, as BIPOC concentration increases, as uninsurance increases, as people living with disabilities increases. The health impact of climate change, air pollution, particulate matter, ozone by other names, increases for many of our medically underserved and historically marginalized populations. So I look forward to our discussion today, and thank you for listening to me cover some of the structural determinants, structural racism determinants associated with disparities and the impact of climate change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cunningham. What you said about air pollution is such an important indicator of health. And it's really good to talk about that as a critical issue with climate change. And what you said about disinvestment really points to the solutions, which is why a lot of people are looking at Justice 40, meaning that the communities that have been disinvested in, we need to invest 40% of our climate dollars and policies to rectify past wrongs. So Sam has joined us, and Sam Grant is going to be our next speaker. So I will turn it over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you, whatever time zone you might be in. We are, rapidly kind of covering perspective here. I can't thank Dr. Brook Cunningham enough for that excellent presentation and covering something I usually spend a lot of time on, which is talking about, redlining and structural racism as kind of the underlying reason that we have these dynamics in the world. And so I'm going to quickly go through this presentation, but I just wanted to shift the frame from thinking about patient Earth to thinking about patient Earthling. So we're all part of this Earth, and we have organized a world ecology of human separation from the Earth, human separation from each other, and humans' division internally within, because we live in a world of separation. Vandana Shiva did a great job of articulating a framework on this that I will quickly move to here. So Earthlings and eco-apartheid. Human beings are part of the Earth, not masters. We need to heal our relations to more intimately honor and embody our presence and roles in the web of life. Eco-apartheid, as Vandana Shiva defined it in 2013, is the organized separation of people from nature, from each other, and the internalization of these divisions in our minds, in our personal habits, and in our cultural practices. There are major human systems failures, building on what Brooke shared, that have caused these really unacceptable, unjust divides between who has access to well-being and who does not. Every year, when you look at the statistics of how well people in Minnesota are doing, we are always ranked one of the best places in the country to live. But when you look at the statistics for African Americans and American Indians, that reality changes drastically. So what are the dynamics in the human systems in Minnesota and around the country and around the world that we need to attend to and transform? One is the failure to demonstrate or to democratize science. Science is both intentionally and blindly wedded to class interests, which are racialized and gendered. Hold on a second, I'm looking at a note here. Oh, okay. And there's a failure to democratize health praxis, organize disconnections between health education, professional health practice, health systems finance, and community and regional health systems, and the failure to democratize ecological knowledge production, which means we treat the environment and the oppressed as economic externalities, no matter how real the costs. One of the documents on your reading list is the great book on Intersectional Environmentalism by Leah Hall, or Leah Thomas, is it? I forget her last name, but she really talks about that people are part of Earth the same way that I do, and we have to begin to really think about people and planetary health as the same conversation, not as two distinct conversations. So there is a way of thinking about our time on the planet that's been popularized, the Anthropocene. I look at our time on the planet in the midst of the climate crisis as the Apartheid-ocene, building on Vandana Shiva's framework, because some of us have access to wellness. Some of us will benefit from changes in markets and technology to advance, resilience in the climate crisis, but we're leaving the vast majority of the planet out of well-being in the ways that we're responding to the climate crisis. So environmental racism is infused in the structural determinants of health. As Brooke talked about, we are more likely to live in substandard housing in marginalized neighborhoods. We are more likely to be othered across the lifespan, including by health professionals. We suffer the intersecting cumulative consequences of a history of discriminatory policies and practices, poorer schools, soil quality, water quality, air quality, and overall, an unjust relationship with the systems that socially reproduce society. We, and when I say we, I'm talking about the people from the oppressed and marginalized communities across the planet, consistently say what we need, but we have systems that consistently refuse to listen to our voices and refuse to honor them as equal of concern and priority as anything else. So shifting that dynamic is the work of this next decade. So here I'm talking about the patterns of the Apartheid. On the left, we have the core pattern through which the world ecology runs, which is beneficiaries of the Anthropocene, people who have loved modernity and get all the frills and chills and thrills out of it. But the consequences of climate impacts experienced most in the periphery, so the people in the core do not feel the same urgency. So if you think about all of the areas of the country that are red areas in terms of politics, the Republican areas, people are extremely denying climate change, and yet they're recognizing some of the worst impacts from climate change in those districts. So that you're seeing in those areas the costs and consequences of climate impacts being borne, by people, even though they're denying what's causing those consequences. Climate change is race and gendered, and there is a class alliance in the global north that sort of excuses the impacts of climate change that are most negatively impacting the global south, because we're not feeling those impacts here. So if you think about the pathway to greening the economy and everybody trying to get an electric car, those electric cars need batteries, and those batteries need cobalt, and that cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it used to be American companies that, controlled those cobalt reserves on the continent, but now it's China that controls those cobalt reserves on the continent. And they have an extremely poor record of worker safety. They have an extremely poor record of environmental integrity in terms of protecting the well-being of the local populations living in proximity to the mines. And so as we think about our objective of electrifying the economy, which I agree with, I want us to decarbonize the economy, but I want us to decarbonize it in a way that's equitable for all people. So we have global power dynamics that reinforce climate apartheid, the way that Desmond Tutu, talks about it in South Africa, and globally. On the right side of the continuum, we have the pattern of the oppressed. At the bottom, we're seeing an increasing number of refugees from the climate crisis all over the planet. We're seeing greater impacts from flooding, from drought, from extreme weather, from impacts on food production, air quality, and water access. We're seeing a braiding of two forms of climate forcing. The physical climate forcing is shaping a social climate forcing, which is increasing racism, increasing patriarchy, increasing xenophobia, increasing other forms of marginalization, exclusion, and oppression. And then we have these global power dynamics that socially reproduced what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about as the triple evils of militarism, impoverishment, and racism. How do we move from this pattern to beloved community? This is what I'll end with, but I want to continue to sort of talk about some of the ugly dynamics that we see. So whether we're looking at North Minneapolis or a native nation, we see the physical climate forcing list on the left side of the ledger, and we see some of the social climate forcing on the right side of the ledger. So increasing drought conditions for urban farmers and gardeners in North Minneapolis and, in other, frontline communities leads to lower productivity of local urban farms, which means the food miles and the carbon footprint increases for consumers. There's more hot days and urban heat island effect in the poor with a higher percentage of substandard housing face increased energy burden or heat stress, plus exacerbation of the racialized social determinants of health. We have increased allergens and pathogens, as a result of climate change, and that's more visits to the emergency room for respiratory distress and the uneven impacts of the spread of pathogens, as we've seen with the pandemic of COVID-19. Decreased biodiversity of culturally significant foods and medicines. The Native nations in Minnesota are doing some tremendous work to defend the rights of wild rice and to defend the rights of nature. And I really would encourage us to join with them in that campaign. And finally, the escalating climate emergency becomes a form of economic forcing. There are higher costs for everything, And this places an undue burden on the people who are most economically marginalized. We're in another stage of inflation right now. So you can't think of anything in your life where the costs aren't rising. Who is having the greatest impact from that? The poor pay more. Great work by the Annie E. Casey Foundation has sort of verified, back in the late 1990s, this pattern that the poor pay more for the basic means of existence. And we need to move towards a form of society that ensures that basic needs are met for all people, including the right to thrive. So wherever you are, I just want you to sort of raise your fist and say health justice is climate justice, because health justice is climate justice. I want you to raise your hand and say that climate justice is racial justice. Raise your hand and make that demand, make that proclamation, and share it with everybody in your local community. There are perspectives on climate realities that we need to attend to. Human disasters are created by human systems. Human systems can be transformed. To transform human systems, we have to shift the dynamics of power and relationship. We are at a moment now of culture wars and political intractability. And the generational transformation cycle we are now in will tilt society either more toward ecological fascism as the form of apartheid, or toward more ecological democracy as a common realization of global beloved community. So in order to shift the tide, we have to do some pattern spotting. We live fewer years with structured inequitable norms shaping life and health outcomes in the marginalized frontline communities of the planet. We have contemporary public policy building on legacies of structural racism and genocide instead of countering those. So after all of the years of genocide of the Native nations in the United States, there's been no apology. After all the years of slavery and Jim Crow and the prison industrial complex, there's been no apology to African Americans, not even political reparations, like, hey, we're all in this together. That hasn't happened. That's the beginning place. An apology and a beginning of conciliation for those crimes against humanity have to happen, here in the United States. And I'm also going to imbricate in this the annual Conference of Parties of the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change. Because as we think about all of those increasing sense of severity of the climate crisis, we're still seeing that the negotiations collapse around the interests of global economic elites, and we're moving further and further away from being able to, keep the global temperature rise from 1.5 degrees, because we keep on burning the planet and burning the people. Finally, I want to say that science is also part of the problem and must shift from its colonial foundation to embody a racially and interculturally just, ecologically democratic foundation. So the steps that I'm proposing are intercultural open science partnerships, linking of social movements with scientists and health professionals, leveraging these linkages to shape new norms and policies, processes, and practices to eradicate climate apartheid and respond sufficiently to the climate crisis, honoring the original instructions and obligation to right relationship with all Native nations. And when we think about the Line 3 fight in Minnesota, myself and many others challenged the governor, challenged the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, challenged every available institution we could talk to, that honoring treaty rights was enough of a reason to reject Line 3. Even though there were many other good reasons to reject Line 3, that was enough of a reason. Everybody said, well, treaty rights are something that the federal government manages in relationship to the Native nations. That's not our purview, so that's out of bounds in this conversation. And we're actually saying, as part of the set of demands for the new day over this next decade, that treaty rights are everybody's obligation at every level of scale in society. And so is countering structural racism. There's not somebody you can turn to and say, that's your job. It's everybody's job to end these forms of oppression. Finally, climate reparations for the loss and damage caused by the physical and social climate forcing of the climate crisis is something that we're going to continue to demand. And we're realizing it in some places where people are better organized and legal and political systems are a little bit more attuned to the reality, but it's not yet normalized across at scale. And we need to make the intersectional linkage of all forms of justice in all systems, in all relations. And, Brooke is at the Minnesota Department of Health, which a few years ago said that we need health in all policies as a framework. And I really think that we need to do a better job of an intersectional analysis of how we look at racial justice and health justice in all policies going forward, and really sort of walk that talk every day of our lives. So here I am talking to you about all of this, but what am I personally doing in relation to the things that I've shared with you today? I'm working on a land justice strategy so that BIPOC farmers can get onto the land in Minnesota. They've been excluded from, land access and land tenure. Most of them are renting from year to year. And if you're only renting on an annual basis, you don't have the motivation or capacity to really heal the soil, which allows you to do carbon sequestration in your farming practices, right? So we're trying to get BIPOC farmers onto the land using a democratic commons-based formation. They're going to own the land together instead of getting onto the land as an individual. So the objectives are get on the land together and nourish local living economies, bring back diverse cultural foodways into the food system, sequester as much carbon as possible in the way you grow food, and bring back as much biodiversity in your growing practices as you can. Working with the Nature Conservancy, we're looking at the future forest of Minnesota, and we're planning between now and 2040 to reforest 1 million acres in partnership with Native nations, so that the way we rebuild the forest supports the integrity of wild rice beds, supports the next stage of evolution of ecological science practitioners on Native nations, engages them in the production of seedlings, engages them in land management practices, and then also does that with the emerging base of BIPOC farmers and agroforesters who are getting onto the land in the diverse habitats of the state of Minnesota. We're doing a great range of intersectional justice work focused on homelessness intervention, focused on economic empowerment in the economy for Black and Latina women business owners. We're doing healing justice work within our organization because we're realizing that if we're not taking care of our own well-being, we can't be a resource for the well-being of the planet around us. And finally, we are beginning to articulate a new framework on research and evaluation, which we're calling Upstream Evaluation, which says, instead of saying, how are our programs doing better, we're asking questions about what are the assumptions that we need to put in check about how our systems and society function, and how do we counter those toxic systems and assumptions so that we begin to create a society that privileges mutual well-being and mutually beneficial relationships. So what do we need to do now? Advance climate and environmental justice in all policies, advocate for deep health equity in all policies, defend treaty rights and practice consistent solidarity with the indigenous peoples of Minnesota and globally, listen to the demands and social change objectives of the BIPOC communities and engage in consistent solidarity with them as a lifelong commitment, and do your part to make democracy work for all, not just for some. If we do these things, the changes we seek in the world will come. Trust that. My conclusions: act locally and globally simultaneously in support of and working to link existing and emerging social movements responding to climate apartheid. Link these movements in ecologically democratic, intercultural, open science partnerships, and then health professionals live and lead at the intersections of climate apartheid and the midwifing of intercultural ecological democracy. Being a health professional is not a value neutral profession. It's a value laden profession. And so we're asking you to really put on Front Street the values of well-being in a way that directly attends to the social and structural determinants of health. And just to end with the intersectional environmentalist pledge that Leah Thomas put together, I just want you to say in your own heart and spirit that I will stand in solidarity with Black and Indigenous and POC communities across the planet. And if you make that demand and you hold yourself and everybody in your ecosystem of relationship accountable, we will turn the tide in the favor of mutuality and the flourishing of planet and people. Thank you for your time. And I will yield as I put up the slide for my dear friend, Reverend Dr. Elika Galloway.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And I greatly appreciate. You can't hear me? I'm unmuted.
No, you're not. Your picture's not up.
I can't hear you, Andre.
Go ahead. There we go.
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, all
Yeah.
right. Hello, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. What a blessing. And so I want to talk really so much of what I have on my mind and on my work, we have already covered. So I will tell you the story of how we were engaged in this work and how we became part and parcel of this great movement. And it started, I thought that it had started by a call, but I'll start back. It actually started with my mother. And my mother is an ancestor now, but all the way through my life, my mother would do 2 or 3 things. And one, she would wake up every day and she would say, "Good morning, all my relatives."
Pastor, I can't hear you. I don't know if your sound cut out. You're frozen.
Technology. Gotta love technology. It joins us, yet is very disconnecting. I think what we heard Dr. Galloway say is waking up every morning and greeting all of my relations. And I hope that we're able to hear more of her story once we're able to be reconnected. Kathleen, how would you like to handle?
Yeah, Leah, why don't you go ahead and present your talk, and then we can circle back to Reverend Galloway.
All right. Bujuan dinawe maganitug, chigamingan dayan mangan dudame, jawanangi kwendish nakaz wawate kwe indigo. It was really important for me to speak in Ojibwe-Moan and share with you where I'm from, my clan and my spirit names. It helps ground me and remind me of who I am in relationship with the earth. I first shared with you that I'm here on the southwestern edge of Lake Superior. I'm from the Loon clan. And then lastly, I shared who I was in relationship as an individual, what my spirit names are. I think it's a really important teaching as we think about equity and writing relationships. And I'm here to speak a little bit about writing the relationship between personal and planetary health by remembering our space and place as humans. I know Dr. Grant spoke very eloquently about the Anthropocene and the Apartheidocene and the impacts that has. So I will really be kind of narrowing in on how do we work to heal the trauma, our human trauma, our personal body's trauma with the planetary body and the trauma that we've caused as humans. I really want to challenge all of you as you start to introduce yourself to the world, introduce yourselves to other humans and plants and the water, to really start thinking about who you are in relationship to the land. For me, that teaching of putting myself last as the individual has really helped me move through the world quite a bit differently. So I invite you to think about, just for a moment, who you are in relationship to the land. And as you think about who you are in relationship to the land, whether it's who you are now in relationship to the land, or who you were as a child in relationship to the land, I invite you to just check in with your body, to notice, if there are any emotions or sensations that start to tingle through and move through your nervous system. I know for me, my go-to in who I am in relationship to the land is always the Wild Rice River. I grew up near the Wild Rice River on the western edge of Minnesota. And for me, that's home. That's what gave me my teachings about how to behave, how to connect, and how to move through right relationship with the natural world. I appreciate what Doctors Grant and Cunningham, and I know the wisdom that Dr. Galloway holds as well. One of the things I just want to plant the seed about is equity in knowledge. And what I'm going to share with you is I'm going to walk you through a conceptual framework that I work with clinical social work students. It's a joining of Indigenous Anishinaabe teachings and Western ways of knowing, which includes polyvagal theory, relational cultural theory, and somatic experiencing. And I want to point out that equity piece is, as humans from the West, we've been primarily elevating those teachings from the West, which truly is a younger science. I don't ever want to distract or dissuade people from holding space for the Western sciences, but I think it's important to remember our older knowledge, our traditional ecological knowledge that has been around for thousands of years. As we talk about equity, as we talk about the inequitable impacts of climate change, I think it's really important to note some of the data from the National Geographic. Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the world's population, yet we are protecting 80% of the global diversity. I want you to just hold that. Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the global population, yet are protecting 80% of the global diversity on this planet that we all share. And as we think about equity and we think about healing trauma, I want to just hold space that those our Indigenous relatives, those that have stayed close to the land and look to their relationship with the natural world as kin, have really done the rest of us a favor. Those of us that have been traumatized through disconnection, through putting technology over relational connection. So I'm going to just walk you a little bit through how I work with students in the mental health realm to work with individuals, families, groups, and communities. I worked with Dr. Christy Manning and Dr. Brenda Hoppy on some research, and we surveyed mental health professionals on their knowledge, attitudes, and practices surrounding impacts of climate change. And what we found is 80% of the clinicians believe and have or believe that climate change is impacting mental health. 60% have seen the impacts on the clients they serve, yet only 10% have actually utilized assessment or intervention tools to work with the clients that they serve. I'm going to share my screen here briefly. So I want to share this quote from our Indigenous relatives in New Guinea, the Asoro tribe. Knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the muscle, or knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the body. You know, we as humans have really placed our intellect, a lot of pressure on our prefrontal cortex when it's actually our body that needs to resonate with the knowledge of what's going on. Knowledge is only a rumor until it lives in the body. Our Indigenous relatives have, noted the intersection of mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, the intersection of the personal and the planetary. Yet most of our work the last 100 years in the mental health field is really focused only on the mind, on the thinking, rational part of ourselves. Western science, our neuroscience folks in that field have finally caught up with those indigenous ways of knowing that indeed, yes, it is the body that we need to enter and work with the mind and the body in the healing process. We've learned that talk therapies only often perpetuate the ongoing trauma response or reinforce the trauma response as we retell our stories, but it's through the body that we actually heal and move through and finish unfinished business. So I want to leave this little nugget of wisdom with you. And this is what again, this is the 30-second tour, but this is what I work with clinical students. It's really important for me to empower them to make sure that they are including the impacts of the natural world on the human psyche, from the assessment process to the intervention and the evaluation process. So in this course that I teach, I've been teaching it for the last 7 years. And again, it's based on Anishinaabe teachings that I have been taught through various elders from White Earth, from Mille Lacs up into Canada and Red Lake. We start with this idea of our original connections, that we as humans are all indigenous to somewhere. This was a teaching that an elder from White Earth, Andy Favorite, who is no longer with us on this plane, would share with the students at White Earth Tribal and Community College. He wanted to remind them of our likenesses and our similarities. And if we all go back into that epigenetic memory, into our blood memories, at one time, all of us hold and continue to hold indigenous wisdom within our veins. Deep within us, there is a reverence for the earth. There is a relationality, reciprocity, and respect that lives within us. But some of us are a little bit further disconnected. Some of our relatives are thousands of years of thinking and behaving in this way. The trauma and the socialization to be on the top of the food chain has impacted how they're moving through the world. So we start with those original authentic connections. And I help students to try to remember, what it looked like, who taught them how to be in relationship with the natural world. What did that look like? We also spend time talking about the disconnection, not only the mind-body disconnection, but the little b, personal body, and the big B, the planetary body, what that looks like. I'm guessing that that my colleagues in the last session spent time talking about the impacts surrounding isolation, depression, addiction, obesity, asthma related, how we as humans are impacted, and how we as humans have been impacting the natural world as far as polluted waterways, decimation of sacred sites, mining and extraction. So we make the correlation of what we are doing, how our trauma impacts, or how we have traumatized the earthly body that gives us life. We then move into clinical processes that look at somatic literacy, somatic tools on how to reconnect. It's through collaboration with the natural environment. It's recognizing and remembering those original relationships with the plants, the animals, the water, the trees. It is through paying attention to our nervous system, to our bodies as we connect and sit and listen to the waves, or watch a chipmunk or squirrel causing mischief in the background. What happens when we connect with them? So I work with students to teach them how to access not only the personal body's natural rhythms, but how to pay attention to the planetary body's natural rhythms. Internal rhythms, meaning paying attention to our nervous system. Then the planetary rhythms, paying attention to the seasons, paying attention to what's happening, when are trees budding, when are certain flowers flowering. So we talk about this process of reconnection, which really involves leaning in, How do we lean in with curiosity with one another, not only one another as humans, but one another with all beings in the natural world? And how do we right the egotistical relationship that many of us are operating out of right now? We are commodifying and objectifying our relatives in the natural world. And to right that, we need to remember and see ourselves as a part of the ecological system here on Earth. As we move through tools of reconnection, we talk about what right relationship looks like. And I believe the founders of relational cultural theory have laid it out eloquently. When we are in a growth fostering relationship, there's a sense of zest or energy, an increased sense of worth. There's clarity, productivity, and a desire for more connection. Originally, RCT was applied to just humans. There's been a handful of us that have challenged the theorists to start applying this to our relationships with the natural world, because not only do we get zest or energy from healthy human relationships, we get zest and energy from healthy planetary relationships. And truly, the whole goal is healing the internal trauma so we can right our wrongs with the trauma we've caused to our planetary relatives. I've got one more photo here. As we talk about and think about equity and social justice, I leave you with this piece of art created by one of our elders up here in northern Minnesota, Carl Galloway. He created this for a conference we held a few years back called Transforming Community. And what you see here is the Earth, our planet Earth, the one that gives us life. And seated around the Earth are all of our human relatives having equal access, having access to a drumstick to provide their voice, their song, at our planetary table. And I invite you to imagine when we get curious, when we start to move towards right relationship, which includes asking permission, having gratitude, but also allowing equal access at the table, what beautiful music we can create and what healing we can create when we start to honor the wisdom, not only human wisdom of our relations, but the wisdom of truly all of our relations, the four-leggeds, the swimmers, the crawlers, the flyers, our rooted relatives, and those water spirits. So I look forward to sitting with you all at the planetary drum, equally listening, hearing each other's voices, and celebrating the knowledge that each of us brings cross-disciplinary to heal both personal and planetary health. I want to say miigwech, meet you, and I really hope that Dr. Galloway has alleviated the technological difficulties. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Leah. Relationship with the earth and relationship with each other has been a theme both in the mental health panel, and Sam Grant talked about it as well. And unfortunately, Pastor Alika has some internet issues and she's not able to rejoin us. We hope we can in the future have her back because she's doing some really critical planetary work. And Teddie Potter has been involved in that. So maybe Teddie can talk about that briefly.
Right. Briefly, I just want to lift up the work of Northside Healing Space, which is a beautiful center. It's a reconverted church or converted church, which has healing gardens, labyrinths, meeting space up in North Minneapolis to bring the community together and to be involved in healing modalities, dietary changes, and meditation practices to heal the community. It's a lovely, lovely work. And then Pastor Galloway is pastor of of Liberty Community Church up in North Minneapolis. And they have a 21st century academy to educate their young people how to be mindful of the planet. They've embedded planetary health in their curriculum, as well as their worship experiences. So we wanted to salute our community representatives. This is not just about health professionals. Our work going forward depends on deep and meaningful connections with the community. So I salute Pastor Galloway and her vision for a eco-healthy Northside space, and bringing her community into the whole idea of what planetary health is about. So stay tuned for future CodeBlue conferences, and hopefully we'll be able to have Pastor Galloway back.
Thanks so much, Teddie. Well, it looks like we have a few questions in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes left. So there's one question about that basically wealthy people cause a lot of the problems with climate change. Should we guilt those people? And how do we handle that? The dichotomy of the people who are lower income and in BIPOC communities are causing less harm to the earth, and the wealthier people are causing more harm. Does anyone want to address that?
I'd love to hear what Leah has to say about it, because she spoke so clearly to this healing, orientation, and I think that would be the place I would want us to start. So Leah, what do you want to say?
Sam, I don't know that I'm going to address it from the person that was inquiring, but what comes to mind for me is I know it's hard. It's hard to have empathy for those that are causing most of the destruction. And what has allowed me to continue to do this work is how do we recognize that trauma, the trauma of the disconnect. I think about my white-bodied relatives from Germany, from England, and from Norway. And as also as an Anishinaabe woman from this land base, I don't know culturally anything about my white-bodied European relatives. I don't know what that means. I don't know what the relationship to the land was like. I don't know that. But I've learned to how do we hold space and look at it through a trauma lens, and maybe use some motivational interviewing techniques. How do we help people remember those relationships so that they recognize that they are causing problems and issues, and that we need the earth. We need to go back to those beginning relationships. I know I didn't answer the question, but for me, I always talk to students, we got to be able to hold empathy for those that just aren't getting it. And they're not getting it because they're so traumatized, and they're in fight or flight because, oh my gosh, I might lose my money, I might lose my mansions or my resources. And to, again, I don't want to downplay the horrific impact that the haves had on our BIPOC communities. Yet at the same time, how do we hold space so they are able to hear? Because I think that's the goal, is how do we help them hear and start behaving better as human relatives? I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cunningham, Grant. I'd like to hear what the two of you have to say.
Brooke?
So, thank you, Sam. I've struggled, and over the last couple of years, sort of tried to lean in, Leah, to the perspective that you have brought. I think the ongoing insult is the challenge with empathy, but also recognizing our shared cultural socialization, oftentimes, right, that makes us do all of the things that you said, right? Approach the earth from this extraction, this commodification, this dismissal vein, this lack of connection. And so when I look at well-being in general in our society, and I feel like it's, and I'm not in this space as a researcher or a professional, but as you all sense, as you move through community, there is something happening, something worsening in terms of connection and care, right? And broader, I think, Leah, you use like this egotism, this self-focus, that is a huge barrier. And so part of the question, as we think about our collective trauma, and some of us moving within those spaces, because that those values, you know, when I talked about structures of racism, I talked about ideas and values too, and those sorts of values and that orientation to have and have not, and disconnection from the broader collective. You know, in 2022, I am just really concerned about the increasing negative and vitriolic impact. Now, as I sit in, you know, in different spaces, and part of the question is around motivation, as now I'm sitting in a more policy space. Part of the question for me is around motivation. And so how to I don't know if assist is the right word, but assist others in gaining insight in their connection to us as a collective and to the earth. And so I would say that I'm very concerned about it, although the blaming, you know, I think we have to be very aware of the mechanisms that have created the current state. I think we have to name those mechanisms and how they sit and all of those structures. And we're in it together, right? And in some ways, I don't know that blaming and shaming, as the question was written, is the best approach, but we can name and be truthful about history and choices.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Brooke. What I'll add briefly.
Yeah, we've run out of time, but Sam, I think we need to close with any words of wisdom that you have.
So I just want to say that we are all relatives. And it was, you know, Leah talks about the Anishinaabe teachings, and it's, you know, Anishinaabe elders and Dakota elders during my time in Minnesota who helped me recognize that I had a choice between sourcing from my anger and indignation at what was happening on the planet. And I was living my life as a clenched fist. And they said, Sammy, that's killing you. It's not changing the system. That's just killing you. And so I made a commitment to healing my own body, healing my own relationships. And so part of my work is to talk to folks who are on the other side and say, you are my relative and I love you. We need to work together and come to the same water and look at how your location on the water is good, but my location on the water is not good. And let's look at the relationship between where the water is good and where it is not. And let me hold you in relationship while we navigate the complex reality that binds us together as relatives. So our work is to be the human in the equation. You know, during the Trump administration, there was all these bumper stickers about you got to be the adult in the room. So those of us who recognize the patterns that need to change, we have to be the humans and the humanizers in the room. We have to bring the healing energy and not exclude them in the way that they've excluded us. We have to heal ourselves so that we don't duplicate that pattern. That's a really important obligation that we have to hold. It's not easy, but it's necessary. So 2 quick examples. When the Nature Conservancy said they wanted to replant 1 million acres of forest in Minnesota, I said, great. How can you do that in a way that advances climate justice? And they said, we don't really know, but we'd like to figure that out. So using an open science partnership, I'm helping them design a strategy to figure that out. The Forever Green initiative that wants to keep water in the landscape is saying all farmers of all scales need to do continuous living cover. And I said, I agree 100%, but how can you advance continuous living cover in a way that also advances opportunities in the emerging perennial economy of agriculture for BIPOC farmers? And they said, we don't know how, but can you help us figure it out? So we created a pathway for a Forever Green as an initiative to be forever equitable. So these are just 2 among hundreds of examples of things that happen when you are willing to be a loving disruptor and a mutual innovator. So we can do this, folks, and we have to. So let's get to work.
Wow, there's so much richness in this discussion. I feel like we need a whole conference just on this topic. And we definitely have to have follow-up conversations because the role of health professionals is so critical in this, and the relationships that we have together and how we can work together with opportunities like you're describing, Sam, and how can HPHC work with other groups to forward climate justice. And I just want to thank you so much, Brooke and Leah and Sam and Pastor Alika. We're going to have to bring her back another time. So we're going to wrap up our panel now and turn it over to Teddie for some last words for the conference.
So thank you all so much. Thank you to all our tremendous speakers. I want to just close with a few reminders. We will be sending out an evaluation form, and in that, you need to complete that if you want your CEUs. But we deeply value the feedback from others. So even if you didn't apply for CEUs, please send your evaluation in. It helps us plan our future conferences and what you will further your education in this whole field. The wonderful program that was sent out with the link, I would urge you to see that again, and perhaps one of the planners can put that in the chat space one more time. It's packed full of resources and links to organizations and other additional things that will help you continue to move along in this area. So you all know Greta Thunberg and the iconic youth activist from Sweden. And she has said, we can't save the world by playing by the rules, because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change, and it has to start today. And you've heard our speakers speak. You can recognize that structures, deep structures, are currently in place, and those need to be changed. We need a fundamental shift in how we live on Earth, what's being called a great transition. Achieving the great transition will require rapid and deep structural changes across most dimensions of human activity. And this is from the Planetary Health Alliance Sao Paulo Declaration. And specifically, the global community has called the health sector to act in these areas. And I think you've heard these themes mentioned today, where we need to aim for carbon neutrality health systems before 2040. We have to reorient our systems towards prevention, health promotion, and health equity. We need to consider social and ecological determinants of health for individuals and communities, and we must advocate for access to culturally appropriate health services as a basic human right. That is the call of the global community and the charge for us as health professionals. So there are times where you might feel like, oh my gosh, we're in this tug of war. There's certain industries and certain businesses that are trying to pull us in one direction, and they have a full might of oftentimes money resources behind them, legal resources behind them, even some government policies behind them. And we can feel the rest of us of what's possible here. Our team is sort of a ragtag bunch, and we might not have the wealth and a lot of the laws, but here's our secret space, our secret juice, our secret sauce. We are trusted sources. And because we're trusted sources, we can invite other people to grab onto our side of the rope and pull. And that's what we want to leave you with the message today, is this is an all hands on deck moment. It is time for us to grab onto that rope, hold it tight, look around the periphery, who's not being invited, who's not here, who's not participating, and add them to our team, because together everything is possible. So hang on, stay connected, and please sign up to join Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate so that you can stay informed of actions along the way. And we thank the entire planning committee, as well as the School of Nursing, which has been able to host this platform and support us in this work. We have only begun, folks, so find each other, hold on to that rope, and pull with all your might. Thank you for being here today.